I mean, it occurred to me, I don't know how many of you have ever gone on one of our partnership trips, either to Palestine or to green grass or whatever. You form a bond with the people on that trip, because that trip essentially is a shared story. And these stories are a good way to develop an empathy within a group and to convey long-term messages. So we always hear each Sunday morning a parable, right? Jesus seemed to know very keenly that parables or stories are fantastic ways of conveying a message. And they mean different things to different people. And they can strike people at different levels. So even a 5-minute story, and that's all you're going to get from me today, is enough. Yeah, there was an immediate little bit of relief. I was saying to Bob, if you're trying to solicit 5-minute stories, what you really don't want to do is solicit college professors, politicians, or especially ministers. But yeah, it's a bad starting spot. But anyway, so yes, we'll move this along. So when you're telling a story, what makes a good story? Well, there's all sorts of tips on the internet. There's things like the 5 C's that you want to develop: character, context, conflict, climax, closure. These are sort of technical approaches to story. It's really people who heard a good story and then try to break it down. What was good about that? But the truth is, when you hear a good story, you just know it, right? It just resonates with you. It stays with you. I've heard stories from people that I could recount to you, and they were 25 years ago, and it still somehow is lodged with me. They have a way of staying with you. So I don't think you have to break it down to the 4 pillars: people, places, purpose, plot. I don't want to sound like an English professor here, because I'm certainly not. But there are tips, and there's good things that you can that you can try to incorporate into your story to make this a useful and a productive adventure for you. There's a whole book out, How to Tell a Story. It was a New York Times bestseller, and I pulled a couple highlights out of it. One is to reclaim your mistakes. So some of the best stories are the times where you screwed up. You did something, everything got out of control. You weren't you weren't that perfect person you like to recount in your story. You made a mistake, and there's something to be said for reliving that mistake and explain to people, because it solicits empathy. We've all made mistakes, and it's a way of connecting with the audience. Give them something to root for. Every story needs stakes. You get more engaged when you're invested in a story. Get specific. I think this is the big trick for me for a MOTH story, which is limited to 5 minutes. The details are what really bring a story out. Carlene mentioned the ghost story. When I tell that ghost story, I go back to the house where this all happened, and I start to remember the old Gothic doors and the wrought iron nails through the doors and the hammered hardware and the noise it made when it slammed unexpectedly. And those sort of details not only make it more real for people, but it takes basically a black and white story and makes it technicolor. And it's very hard to do, as you'll see. I'm going to be rushing in a 5-minute story. It's fine when you're sitting around the campfire and you've got 20 minutes or something, you can go into this. But they also recommend memorizing. Now, I didn't quite do this, but I'm not too far off. Memorizing the first line and the last line of the story. Now, when I get into the actual MOTH, the dictates of what they recommend for a MOTH story, one of the first things they say is don't memorize the story. This is not just a performance thing. In fact, if you read comments online about the MOTH stories, people seem to prefer the amateur storyteller over the refined, professional. A lot of this stammering over words and stuff, it it makes the story real to people. And so just coming up and rehearsing a memorized story, it doesn't, again, it doesn't connect with people as well. But by memorizing the first and last lines, you know you've got yourself a firm start, and you know where you're going. And the bullet points in between, you've retold these stories probably many times. Hopefully they'll pop into your head as you go along. But the idea is that if you told this story 10 times, it wouldn't be exactly the same every time. And we'll get to that. And then try to have fun. Well, okay. Some people can do this. Bob is one of these people who can stand up in front of people and just talk, and he has fun. For me, it's a little harder. For some people, it's nearly impossible. The overcoming the fear of standing up and sharing a story is difficult. And some people would prefer to write their story. But that's not what we're going to do here today. Now, I threw these in because I thought you might find them interesting. I'm not going to dwell on them. But as it turns out, of course, scientists can't leave these things alone. They've actually looked at how your biology changes when you're listening to a story. And it turns out that when people listen to a storyteller, there's actually hormones that are released. And they actually stimulate different parts of your brain. Dopamine. I mean, it's interesting that suspenseful stories actually create chemical changes in people. Oxytocin, I mean, people all of a sudden relate with compassion to the storyteller in a certain story. I think that's sort of fascinating stuff. There's stuff like the triggering the release of vasopressin is just something where you all of a sudden start to trigger emotions in people's faces. Endorphins, the humor, the laughter, you can like a funny story is oftentimes the one people remember most. Where it gets a little tricky is when you start telling these in the church steeple kind of ghost stories. So those can release cortisol, adrenaline. Those can actually trigger fight or flight kind of reactions in people. I think we're seeing this at a national kind of level right now. Bad decisions, intolerance, all these things can be the result of, cortisol or adrenaline in this system. Also, and this one is of particular concern to me, I used to, when I taught at Central Connecticut State University, I only taught once a week because I traveled for my work, my other work. And that means that I had to teach 2-hour and 40-minute long lecture courses. Those are brutal. And you absolutely do not want to trigger the release of serotonin in your students. And you'd see the heads nodding, and quick, tell a scary story, do something else, right? So we all have stories, is the first thing I'd like to say. You all have stories. Now, the way this became so apparent for me is a very strange thing. I was suddenly called to fill in for an employee who got quite sick. I'm not a NACE level inspector, but that's what this job called for. And since my friend was sick, I went in and filled in for him. This was a job where he was doing coating inspection of steel that was being erected on the 56th floor of a skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan. So I would train in every day, go to the top of this. It was in December. It was like 38 degrees, 40-mile-an-hour winds, and I'm sitting on a steel girder up there. I'm thinking, why did I do that? What's the rationale? But they couldn't do any coating when it's that cold. There's all sorts of environmental. So I had nothing to do all day. I mean, literally, my job was to watch paint dry. But I couldn't even do that. So I'm sitting there with my little inspection book, and I listened to the MOTH over the weekend, which we'll get to. And it occurred to me, if I got sucked into a MOTH presentation, what story would I tell from my life? And so I started jotting down little notes. I remember back when I was just a kid, and I dropped that milk bottle and cut all the nerves in my wrist. And so blah, 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 blah. All of a sudden, after the course of a couple weeks. And then even for years after that, stories would occur to me. I ultimately wrote down 65 different little stories that I thought these could be developed into something. So, of course, I retired a year ago, and the first thing I decided to do was, I need to write down my stories. So, Deb rolls her eyes, but every morning I roll out of bed, go sit at the computer, and generate another story. And I've got 50 of them, and I'm done. That's it, 50. I tried this, telling a story as a way of stimulating some interaction with my nieces and nephews out on a Cape family weekend. We were all out there, and I went around to all the nieces and nephews, and I said, tonight, cocktail hour, you're going to be responsible for a 5-minute MOTH story. And I told that teacher, I said, I don't know which ones I'll select, but be ready. And cocktail hour rolls around, and I say, Ashley, go ahead. And she comes up and she tells a story. And I was floored. These were great little stories, and everybody was into it. It really was a fun evening. So we all have stories. It's just sometimes you have to be forced to recount them. All right. So what is the MOTH? So many of you have heard the MOTH. It's a kind of a regular thing on NPR over the weekends. It started out as a nonprofit that was just promoting storytelling. It goes, I think its origins go back to 1997. They present live stories, and they have storytellers sign up to do this. They get vetted to some extent nowadays. But this has gone worldwide. And they'll have these MOTH slams, and people come from all over. It's this big auditorium, and you hear a dozen storytellers tell a little story. Now it's a weekly podcast. You can hear it on public radio. So what are some of the guidelines? So the story has to be a true story. So this isn't just some fantasy. It's something from your life, and you're recounting it. You have to be there then. We've all heard great stories. No fair taking somebody else's story. Right? This has got to be your story. So we're not looking for journalism. We're looking for just recounting your own story. Here's the hard one. You have to keep it within a 5-minute timeline. Now, of those 50 stories that I've written down, there's probably 4 or 5 that would actually, maybe I could squeeze into the format. It's not that easy. So keeping it within a 5-minute timeline, there's a grace period or whatever. I guess you could threaten people with the giant hook, and all of a sudden it just starts creeping out in about 4 minutes and gets closer and closer, and they'll wrap up. But the 5-minute timeline is not easy. So obviously you don't want a misogynist story. You don't want, I mean, there's certain stories that obviously aren't appropriate. You're not allowed to use notes or props. This is also a problem. I've written down all my stories. It would be a lot easier for me, and there'd be a lot more detail, and the language would be a lot more colorful if I just read it to you. But that's not what they're looking for. They want a spontaneous story, and so you're not allowed to write it. And here's another problem. Back when I used to do children's sermons, the key was have a good prop. You could keep those kids engaged as long as you had the perfect prop. To just venture out there with no prop and to do what, like when Allison does a children's sermon, she solicits response from the children. That's a nightmare. They could go anywhere. I would not even look at the children. So no props, no engagement. It's a totally different thing. Anyway, and as I said, no memorization. All right, so we'll avoid that. So my thought was, we're going to give you 2 examples today. I'm going to tell a real quick story, and then I'm going to have a champion story step in and do it right. We're going to tell 2 little MOTH stories just to give you an example. So I would like this to become sort of a way of engaging the community, sharing stories, sharing our past experiences, getting to know more about people. This seems like it has potential to be a good way for us to become more interconnected. All right? The trick is getting people to actually do it. And most people, I don't know. So I have been going around and twisting people's arm, as Bob can tell you. So I have a sign-up sheet. I should just circulate it because it's too easy for you to get out of here. Just walk. So just sign up. Flip that page over. Flip that page over as soon as we fill it up. But this doesn't commit you to anything. This just means you're open to the idea of trying to think about a story, and maybe you can work on one. And we have a little MOTH group, and we would actually, it's moving way too fast. What you need is your name, an email, so yeah, there's a pen right there. So anyway, this can then be a future adult forum. Maybe in a couple months, if I can get 5 or 6 people to sign up, we could do just an adult forum with MOTH story. It could also be a potluck dinner. So, of course, that draws more people because there's brownies. So, All right. So anyway, that's going to circulate around. I'd love it if people say they'll give it a shot. They'll think about stories and see if they come up with something. And if we can get 4 or 5, I think we're in business. All right, so I will give you a brief 5-minute story to give an example of this. This is technically a prop, so I'm cheating. But that's all right. Ignore the background. All right. Back in 1981, I graduated from the architecture school at the University of Notre Dame. And I started at a small architecture firm in Avon, Connecticut. And I was at that architecture firm for several months when the owner came to me and he said, "Tom, we have a new job. I've been approached by a developer who wants to take an old factory building and convert it into maker space and light industry." This was a textile manufacturing company down in Middletown, Connecticut. It was called Russell Manufacturing Company. They went out of business in the late 60s, but the plant is still there, and there's a security guard who can let you in and you can do the measurements. And I said, yep, that's great. So I got another young intern, Mike, and the two of us drove down to Middletown, where I'd never visited, and we drove up to the factory. An old security guard opened up the big chain link fence, led us into the abandoned parking lot. He showed us into this huge factory building. We walked in, and I was just kind of floored. It was acres of manufacturing space. There was these old wood block floors soaked with oil, these huge mechanical looms, overhead drive shafts everywhere connecting with big belts, big bolts of cloth, bobbins everywhere, and hanging from everything was this lint, this manufacturing lint that was all, and it was just like the people walked off the job and abandoned, and that was it. So we spent the morning kind of getting measurements, getting a column grid, drawing this place up. And by the early afternoon, we'd gotten through most of the manufacturing area, but there was, on the southern end of the whole complex, an office tower that went up. So we decided we'll measure that too. So we measured the first floor, and I'm looking at my watch, we're running out of time. I said, Mike, you take the second floor. I'm going to go up to the third floor. We'll divide and conquer, try to knock this off because we got to get out of here. He said, sure. So he went to the second floor, I ran up to the third floor. When I got up to the third floor, it was clear that these were the executive offices. They were individual offices with secretarial areas, and I kind of measured my way through all this. There was a big board room and a huge conference table, and I kind of got those dimensions. And finally, at the northern end is what was clearly the president's office. And I walked in there and it had, the wood paneled walls and plush carpeting and oil paintings. And on one side of the room was a big mahogany desk. And behind it was this plush red leather chair. So I got the dimensions and I just went over and I sat in the chair and spun around and put my feet up on the windowsill. And I'm looking out over the factory, the acres of factory. And I just, being an idiot, started to be an idiot. And I'm like, it's all mine. Looking out the window, I'm like, the vast minions, as far as I can see, 1,000 workers working to increase my empire, and I'm president of it all. And I'm looking out, and I hear Mike call, "Tom, we gotta get going." I'm like, "Yup, here I'm coming." And I hopped up out of the chair, and I went upstairs. We went back to the office. I wound up putting it on the computer. We drew it up, came up with a bunch of designs with my Russell Manufacturing logo and everything. Of course, the developer backed out and nothing ever happened. And the job went away, and I forgot all about Russell Manufacturing. So fast forward 33 years later, I am no longer in architecture. I am teaching at Central Connecticut State University, and I've come up early for classes because I'm going to take my father out to lunch. Now, my father is in a retirement community in Farmington, Connecticut, so I go pick him up, and we find a little park on the Farmington River, and we sit at a picnic table, and we're sitting there by the river, and he's telling me stories of his career. In his career, he was an industrialist, and he became president of a big manufacturing company in New Britain, Connecticut, called Fafner Bearing. So he was, for years, president of Fafner Bearing, and he tells me the stories, and I said, "Dad, I knew about your career, but what I never knew was about your father's career. So Pawpaw died when I was only 11. I really don't even know what he did." He said, "Well, he also, we had parallel career. He was an industrialist out in Ohio. He ran a big operation, but it ran into financial trouble during the Depression. And so he took a job as general manager of a plant back here in Connecticut. And he moved the whole family from Ohio back east up to Hartford, and that's where he worked for most of his career. And he was general manager for years. And then the last several years of his career, he became the interim president and was president of that company while they trained the owner's son to someday take over." I'm like, wow. That is weird that it's so similar to yours. "So what was the name of this company?" And he said, "Well, it was a textile manufacturer down in Middletown, Connecticut. The name of the company was Russell Manufacturing." And I'm staring at the Farmington River, and the hair is going up as I suddenly realized that some 33 years prior, I've been sitting in my grandfather's chair. Freaky. You don't have to tell that story well. It's just so freaky it does its own thing. Let's turn this over to the next.
5 minutes and 27 seconds, honey.
What's that?
5 minutes and 27 seconds.
Okay, so there was a key slide there that said something about a 1-minute grace period. Yeah.
I'm not timing you.
I mean, I hacked that thing down. I was at 7.5 minutes when it started. I'm going to put the sign-up sheet right here for those of you who didn't get it. Right there. Right? Bob, you want to regale us?
I'm going to start good morning, everybody. My kids may want to hear this. They may not want to hear it. Before I get started, so this doesn't count in the 5 minutes. Whoever's keeping track of that. Tom was mentioning writing down his stories after he retired. I had the opportunity to do this 2 years ago when my 2 children got me for Christmas a subscription to Storyworth. And some of you may know what Storyworth is, where they provide you a number of questions and you write them down, and at the end of the process they put it into a hardbound book. So my kids threw out all the Storyworth questions and they put their own questions in for me to answer about our own family relevant to that. And it took me a year and a half to answer these 50 questions. And they are now in a hardbound book.
Wow.
Memoir, Robert F. McCracken. And it really, really feels good that not only my children, but my grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and beyond can have this as a record. So that, I just wanted to share that with you. So no more props. How does that go? I don't want that to go away. Oops. The title of my talk this morning is How Happenstance and Ingenuity Started a Wonderful Life. And as with Tom's, this story has the added advantage of being true. The year is 1960, and I was a brand new naval officer, just having graduated from the NROTC program in college. And I was enrolled in the Basic Officers Submarine School curriculum and program at the naval base, the submarine base in Groton. Which, by the way, and this will come later, the naval base, as you probably know, the submarine base is directly across the Thames River from the Connecticut College for Women. That'll come later. So we were 50 or 60 hours in this basic submarine school program where we learned all about the systems on the submarine and how to navigate and all that. We went on 3 different one-week cruises to learn about submarines. And we were working hard. It started in June, and we were working very hard. And during that, and we were all bachelors, so we lived in the bachelor officers' quarters on the base, the BOQ. And we had really very little social outlet or activity during that time. We were working hard. The only outlet we had was the first-time ability to go to the officers' club, and in fact get a charge account at the officers' club liquor store, which I did. So we were working hard. And come early September, in the dining hall of the BOQ, I had a very enterprising classmate who got up and tinkled his spoon on the water glass and said, gentlemen, I have an announcement. The Connecticut College for Women is now in session. And one of the reasons that he got a lot of cheers was our submarine school class was the very first in the history of the submarine force that allowed us to come right from college or the academy into the submarine program. Prior to that, you had to spend a year and a half on the fleet, out in the fleet before you could go. So we were right out of the academy in college. And so we were ready for the party to just continue. And Luke Riley was my classmate's name, and he wasn't just into making announcements. He drove over the next morning on Saturday, he drove over to Connecticut College, parked in front of a dorm at Brandon, went in and confronted the dorm mother. Back then, each dorm had a dorm mother. You did not get past the dorm mother. And he told her of his plan, and he said, I have over on the submarine base 12 young officers who would really like to go on a group blind date because there's a square dance going to happen up at the Salem firehouse tonight. Could you line up 12 girls? And so she called somebody, one of the girls came down, and he talked to her. In retrospect, her name was Carol Hunt. In retrospect, she was a roommate of my future wife. And asked her if she could line up 12 girls. And so she tried, went upstairs, came back down in 20 minutes. So I got 12, pick us up at 6:30. So Luke hightails it back to the subbase, ran up and down the halls of the BOQ, beating on our doors. He didn't have 12 guys lined up. That was his entrepreneurial approach to life. That was who he was. And so he finally got 12 of us together. 5 or 6 of us had cars. And that evening we drove over to Connecticut College to pick up the young ladies. On the way to Connecticut College, you drive right past the United States Coast Guard Academy, which is directly across the road. And I've sometimes been asked, did we have any competition for lining up dates at Connecticut College? And I said no, we had no competition. because the Coasties, as we call them, they're a really nice cadets. And they had no cars, and they had curfews. And we were newly commissioned officers, only one bar, but we were officers. And we had cars and no curfews. It was easy. So we went and we picked up the young ladies and we drove to Salem, and whoever it is that runs a square dance got us all together and had to pair us up for the square dance to come. And Sally and I were paired up because we were the shortest in the group. So it was a very nice evening. We enjoyed each other, had some refreshments, and drove the young ladies back to campus. It just so happened that since we were paired up, Sally was in the passenger seat. And when she was getting out of the car, I said, I would like to see you again.
Excellent.
And she said, that would be nice, so would I. So, catches me up a little bit. So we started the date. And we had a good time. A lot of the dates, since I could afford it, the only thing I could afford was to go to the officers club. And Friday and Saturday nights, the happy hour drinks were 25 cents each. A side story is 2 or 3 weeks after that, I think I behaved, having too good a time, and didn't behave properly, so I sent a dozen roses to Sally over at Connecticut College. And years later, one of her roommates told me that she grabbed the bouquet and laid down on the bed and hugged it. So, fast forward to December, when we were graduating from sub school, and there was a party each time for the graduating class, to kind of celebrate the graduating. But it's where you pick your duty station of where you wanted to go for your now real submarine. And there were some, and you pick, by the way, in the order of your class standing. And I think I was number 3 in the class. So there were some very enticing places to go. In addition to New London and Norfolk, there was Key West, Florida, San Diego, California, Hawaii. And so I was the number 3 picked. And I picked the USS Sailfish, headquartered and home ported in New London. And the relief and smile that came over her whole countenance was palpable. Anyway, let's now step back when we were dating, and we were both very busy. Sally was majoring in botany and chemistry at Connecticut College. I was working hard on my, both in the fall, my courses, and in the spring, my new shift. And so we had to figure out when we were going to see each other, which was difficult to do. And we decided, and she suggested this, that we get together in the evening after she finished studying in the library, and we would go down to the Capitol Coffee Shop in New London, which is right on Broad Street, around the corner from Second Congregational Church. And so the deal was that I would go pick her up at the library at 10 o'clock when it closed, and we'd go down to the Capitol Coffee Shop, have coffee, and come back. The speed bump was that you could not take a girl off campus after 7 p.m. It was against the rules. So I went up to the library the first time, and here's where the ingenuity came in. She got in the back seat of my car and laid down on the floor. Flat down on the floor. Couldn't see anything. So I would drive, and by the way, there was a guardhouse at Connecticut College. Man, that's not sexist because there was a man in it. And you had to get past the guard. So when I came in, I could just wave at him and say, I'm going to say hello to my girlfriend. We'd go up to the library, she'd lay down on the floor, we'd drive back out, and I'd wave at the guy. It's fine. We went down, we had a great time at the Capitol Coffee Shop 2 or 3 times a week. And then when I would come back, she could sit upright in the seat next to me because you could bring a girl back to campus anytime. Take me off campus. And this went on for about 6 months. To this day, I will never know. Nobody will ever know whether we actually pulled the wool over this guy's eyes for 6 months, or whether he knew about it all along because everybody else did it. We will never, ever know. But what I do know for sure is that happenstance in Salem and her ingenuity at the Conn College Library started a wonderful life. Longer than 5 minutes, but the first part didn't count.
Yeah, so that's one of those, it may have gone over 5 minutes, but guess what? Nobody cared. Everybody was glad that it did. So, anyway, I hope that whets your appetite a little bit for what these stories can be and what they might become. And I'd love it if everybody signs up and give it a shot. I don't know where, yeah, we've got 9 victims, but there's a lot more people here than that, so keep signing. And thank you. Any thoughts? Anybody have ideas about this? Adult forum?
Thank you, Tom. I think this is going to be a lot of fun. Yeah.
I think it's got potential.
Yes.
Yeah. Lauren?
Well, I know we talked about the possibility of the next time doing
Yeah.
it in kind of a potluck format
Yeah.
in Fellowship Hall on a.
Do people have a preference of whether this would be an adult forum or a potluck?
I think potluck is more fun.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So of course the great hurdle is the church calendar. So I'll get together with you and we'll plan the night for it. But in the meantime, yeah, think through your archives and see what you can come up with. Thank you.
Great.